Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The Jungle Book from 1967. The Jungle Book has to be one of the most fun party movies that Walt Disney Animation ever made. It is a fun, easygoing film. I've gotten drunk while watching this movie countless times. It is a fun, free-flowing movie that just has this amazing energy to it. I love watching Baloo and Mowgli dance together. I love hearing the bare necessities. I love all the songs to it. I love the energy to it. It's just one of the most fun animated movies probably ever made. And it was actually probably one of the most important films made in the history of the Walt Disney Animation Studio because it came at a crucial point where they absolutely needed this film to be successful to keep making animated films. And because of its massive success, it let the animation studio to be able to continue to make animated feature films, even though it looked like maybe that would be over, as this was the first film to come out after the death of Walt Disney and the last animated film to have any involvement by him. Although Aristocats was approved by him before he died, he didn't really work on that as much. He had a lot to do with this movie, so this is really the last Walt Disney animated feature film, and it was a really important movie, and it absolutely delivered, bringing us a timeless, fun classic. Walt Disney really wanted a populist hit that everybody liked after the mixed results of Sword in the Stone, and man, this movie to me always delivers. It's hard not to watch this and start singing songs and talking about how wonderful it is, and even if I talk to other people about it, they just start glowing with their enthusiasm for this movie. This movie is such a wonderful gift of a fun animated kids movie, but just a fun animated movie in general. The Jungle Book is probably one of my favorite Disney animated films and probably one of the most beloved, and it's both of those things for a very good reason. Mowgli, who has been raised by wolves in the jungle, and after they realize Shere Khan is coming back to the jungle, the wolf pack has a meeting and decides that Mowgli needs to go to the man village, and Bagheera decides that he will take Mowgli to the man village until they run into Baloo, who starts telling Mowgli about the bare necessities and who's a jungle bum, but realizes he needs to take Mowgli back because Shere Khan will eventually attack and kill him because Shere Khan hates man because of his guns and his fire. So Bagheera and Baloo go on a journey to take Mowgli back to the man village as they run into King Louie and even Shere Khan as they hopefully eventually get Mowgli to leave the jungle and reassimilate himself with mankind. This was released 10 months after Walt Disney died. He had a lot to do with the tone of this film and deciding it should be lighter because Sword in the Stone hadn't done as well, and so he originally had his story guy Bill Peet working on it for a year and making it much darker and more accurate to the Rudyard Kipling book, but Disney decided not to do that. There were all sorts of ideas, like Mowgli would go back to the man village, but then a poacher would send him back to find the treasure that King Louie had under his kingdom, and all sorts of stuff like that. I think they made kind of a smart move. A lot of people who like the book disagree with this movie. The way Disney adapts things isn't particularly faithful whatsoever, and they've never really given a shit about the source material. It's just kind of how the studio works. The original guy, Bill Peet, and Disney had a lot of disagreements about the direction. Bill Peet actually quit the studio over those disagreements and cut off his relationship with Disney after working there for 25 years and didn't repair their friendship before Disney died, unfortunately. But told, I believe it was Larry Clemens, the guy who replaced him, he handed him the book of the Jungle Book and said, "Don't read this," which is like, okay, you're just saying it? All right. I mean, we've all thought that you don't really care, but like, wow. But I don't mind that this takes such a division because really, when you're talking about works of art, they should be able to stand on their own. And I think the difference is we live in a time where people, when they're adapting things, try to be so expertly faithful and has to be exactly like the book. And really, literature and movies are different mediums, first off, so that's a thing. But also, I think what they did here is make such an amazingly fun, easygoing movie. I kind of don't mind the changes at all. I've never really minded it. And I think Disney made a lot of smart moves in doing that and making a really entertaining, beautiful kind of Hollywood movie. Now, the interesting thing about this coming out in 1967 is 1967 is always regarded as the beginning of kind of the new Hollywood and the end of old classic Hollywood, the studio system, where you have Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate. And then you have have things like Dr. Dolittle was considered like kind of the end of the old guard, and a lot of those studio heads were dying off, a lot of those directors were dying off, and certainly Walt Disney was part of that group. Those were his peers. But Disney seemed to be able to go past all the 70s stuff and keep existing in kind of this classic Hollywood world, at least until like the 80s, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. I think probably the reason this film isn't talked about in film history with 1967, even though it is one of the most beloved films from that year, is because it doesn't really fit into that narrative. But it's also kind of amazing that in the time where people are getting more socially conscious, making darker, certainly more violent films, The Jungle Book comes out and is a huge, massive hit. Right when you think more the classic studio Hollywood big musical isn't going to work anymore, The Jungle Book comes out, and you can't really deny The Jungle Book. It doesn't really reflect its time in film history, certainly, but it's so wonderful and light. I think people just love a good movie, and The Jungle Book is definitely a good movie, even if it doesn't really fit into its time period. It's interesting when I realized what year this film came out in. It was like pretty remarkable. Most of these films around this period are directed by Wolfgang Reiterman, who had directed 101 Dalmatians, Sword in the Stone, and Sleeping Beauty before this, and pretty much directed every Disney animated film from Sleeping Beauty in the late 50s till The Rescuers in 1977, and then Fox and the Hound he was simply a producer on in 1981. The Xeroxography style that was going on at the time is very much reflective in his period of directing all these films. I really like his period of Disney animated films. They always have more of a home quality, a lived-in quality, a sketchier style. Certainly a lot of that has to do with the Xeroxography, I think, that was going on at the time. That period of Disney animated films is something I really liked as a kid. It's something I almost could relate more to. The earlier films feel like untouchable masterpieces, and although I watched those probably just as much, I kind of like this different quality to it in this period of Disney films. It was actually true that they were considering getting rid of the animation side of the studio. The fact that this film was such a massive hit absolutely helped the studio to decide to keep around the animation department, because Jungle Book was a massive hit, and they even re-released it in 1978, 1984, and 1990. Because Disney was smart, he kind of did a similar thing to what had happened when he had made Pinocchio. And when Pinocchio bombed pretty badly, they needed a cheaper, more simpler film that was more audience friendly to be a hit again and help keep the studio going. And that was Dumbo. The Jungle Book, the idea he was having with that harkens back to that. It's interesting that Disney certainly knew what worked and what kind of film the studio needed at that point. Actually, Dumbo and The Jungle Book are two of my favorite Disney animated films because they're short, they're sweet, they're very well condensed, they're very simple, but especially this one is a lot of fun. The screenplays are incredibly tight. The flow of this movie is very, very quick. It's 78 minutes and it really feels it, but it moves so briskly. Probably the most fun I've ever had while watching any film is the segments from when Baloo shows up to even going into the King Louie sequence. It's just 20 minutes straight of the movie until Bagheera and Baloo have that serious conversation at night. It is just constant fun from that point on. I mean, literally when Baloo shows up, I'm like, oh, here we go. I mean, the whole movie is fun, certainly, but that whole chunk of it is just some of the most fun I think I've ever seen in motion pictures, total. From the Bare Necessities to I Want to Be Like You, those are absolute crowd pleasers. They bring the house down. And the music by the Sherman Brothers, that's Richard M. Sherman and Robert B. Sherman. They do such an amazing job. Apparently they had a different score that was a little too serious, and Disney made sure it was a lot more fun, which definitely helps the vibe of this. The score helps the lighter and easygoing feel to The Jungle Book. Now, the voice cast in this film, I think this is pretty much a who's who of great character actors that Disney actually handpicked. The most important actor, I think, is really Phil Harris, who, believe it or not, Disney met at a party, which if you're gonna meet the voice of Baloo in this version of The Jungle Book, it should be at a fucking party. I can't believe that's how Disney met Phil Harris and decided he should be Baloo. To me, that just sounds so perfect. Most of the characters were actually modeled after the voice actors. This is the first movie to really do that. I don't know if they did that in shorts or animated series or anything like that. This is the first movie to ever do that. I love Phil Harris in both live action film and animated film. I've reviewed a couple films he's been in live action wise, but his work as Baloo, this is one of the all-time great voice casts, but his performance as Baloo is one of the all-time great performances. The voice cast in this is just simply amazing. He really got a who's who of classic Hollywood character actors, and so amazingly, impeccably well cast. I mean, it's just awe-inspiring when I think of, like, when you really get into classic Hollywood and you know who all these character actors are, you're like, holy shit, I would see a movie with all these guys. They would never make it, but like, that's the kind of cool thing about The Jungle Book is all these guys knew how to play these things very well. I mean, they're very well trained character actors and they know how to do do this. He gets the jungle bum so well, and you just love watching him, and Phil Harris just exudes that the whole time, kind of like half Dean Martin, half John Wayne, and all awesome. Then, of course, you have, Sebastian Cobbed, who does Bagheera, who I think not enough people talk about, but I think is really, really good in this. He has a real protective, kind of deep, intelligent voice. Like, he sounds like someone who would be your mentor, and Bagheera is certainly Mowgli's mentor. Mowgli is, of course, voiced by Bruce Reiterman. I hope I'm saying their last name right. I'm sorry if I don't. Wolfgang Reiterman would have his sons voice characters in the films he directed in The Sword in the Stone, and as Christopher Robin in Winnie the Pooh. Then you have George Sanders. I heard Tarantino say George Sanders has one of the greatest voices in all of cinema. I love George Sanders. Anytime I see a movie and George Sanders shows up, I grin from ear to ear. Him as Shere Khan in a movie full of perfect casting, George Sanders steals the show. I can't even describe how immaculately English and evil George Sanders is. You kind of love to watch him. Anytime I think of this movie, I think of George Sanders. It oozes out of him how good he is. Apparently, out of all the voice actors they cast in this, the character that was most based on their at least English voice actor was George Sanders and Shere Khan. Louis Prima as King Louie. Just the scatting alone. When Louis Prima and Phil Harris scat, I was like, holy shit, this is hardcore scatting. The scatting it gets so intense at certain points. Apparently, it's all based on Louis Prima really wanted the role and came and performed with his whole band, and it's supposed to represent kind of more of a New Orleans jazz kind of vibe, but I love how he's have a banana. And of course, I cannot not talk about Sterling Holloway, who's also the voice of Winnie the Pooh, but is the voice of Kaa in this. I love Sterling Holloway, especially for Wild Boys of the Road, but he has such a distinct, amazing voice. I got a letter. He has such a weird, kind of strange, kind of soapy voice, and it kind of shows almost what Pixar understands later is you don't really need stars. You cast more about the acting, and you don't really have to cast on star power, because frankly, kids don't really give a shit about star power. They just want to see a cool cartoon, and in that case, you can cast kind of the best person for the role rather than do kind of the Hollywood system where you have to have a star in it. Thus, what Pixar has done through countless films, although they have had stars in there, but they cast them perfectly, and this sets that fucking precedent. The vultures, towards the end, they are modeled, at least one of them is modeled after the Beatles. The Beatles were offered to be in this film and to sing the song That's What Friends Are For, which was originally written to be more Beatlesy, and John Lennon poo-pooed it because he's a dumbass and a jerk. A couple of the vultures are still based on the Beatles, particularly one everyone says is based on George Harrison. I just think it's a general Beatle type of thing, but there's the bald one and the blonde one, which I guess is just kind of like a hippie-ish type of vulture. This was 1967. At this point, I don't think the Beatles would have done a Disney movie. I've always really loved this movie, and it's always been one of my favorite Disney animated films. It has such a fun vibe to it, a loose vibe to it. It's so easy to put on. Really, the whole film is about kind of growing up, but I think the interesting thing is it's about growing up naturally. Mowgli doesn't fight or have a problem with going to the man village. She just sees a cute girl and she drops her water jug and he's all in. And I think it really works for the film, and it works for how life is. You kind of just fall into something and you realize oh shit, I'm older now. I did not know how that happened. So in a way, it's a little more natural, but I've always loved this movie. I believe I saw it in the 1990 re-release. I'm not exactly sure. I know I had the McDonald's toys, but it's always been this beautiful, fun Hollywood movie, and it reminds me of what I like about big studio productions, is that they can be fun, they can be free, they can have beautiful songs, they can make me smile and have a good time. This can be serious and funny, and it has amazing acting all throughout it. It is, frankly, to me, one of the almost perfectly made Disney films. I know there's better technical made Disney films. I just can't help but really love this film. I love this period personally. It gets being a big Disney animated film better than any of them, as just kind of a pure, joyous, entertaining film. I think really one of the things Disney definitely understood is how to entertain people. This is how we went out. I think it's almost perfect, and it's a perfect statement to be I'm ending on this beautiful, fun movie at a time when that seemed like that was kind of going away. You can be a nitpicker and go, oh, it's just a light, dumb movie, but there's a certain artistry to that. And when I watch this film, I'm just shocked at how they can stuff all this thing into this movie, how it can flow so well, how all of it can work as perfectly and as magnificently as this movie does. I love watching this film. There's just so much fun in this movie. It's almost like an expert filmmaker who knows how to make a fun film. It's all of these animators who know how to make a perfectly entertaining film working at the top of their game, because they were worried about their jobs. Everyone was worried that this was going to keep going, and their answer to save all of that was one of the most beloved movies movies of all time and one of the absolutely most fun films ever made. And I think that says a lot about probably the continued success of the Disney animated films throughout the next 10 years while the 9 old men were still there, and the continued success of the studio was because you had people who really believed in making really fun, really entertaining, really joyous, big budget movies for all audiences. And just as much as I love getting drunk with this movie, I'm sure I'll love watching this with maybe, my future children or nephews and nieces, and they'll have just as good of a time as I had. The Jungle Book is absolutely one of the most entertaining Disney films, and one of my favorite films to just put on and forget about your troubles and just think about the bare necessities. And I think that's really what makes this one of my favorite Disney films, and maybe probably one of the best Disney films ever made. So if you have seen The Jungle Book and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.